Chapter 12. The doctor was examining one of the walls of the inner chamber. He peered through a magnifying glass held close in front of his half-moon spectacles, while Atkins held both the torches. "Judging by the amount of weathering and discoloration of these marks," the doctor said as he pocketed the magnifying glass, "I'd say that the work here was done quite recently." He turned to Atkins and whipped off his spectacles. "Maybe as little as 20 years ago." 23, actually." Atkins swung round, waving the torches in a low arc. The beams of light passed over a bundle of rags in the far corner of the chamber, then stopped and swung back. The rags were untangling themselves and sitting up. A grubby, weathered face lifted towards them, eyes gleaming in the light. Blackened teeth cracked into a broken smile, and the figure slowly stood up. The track Tegan was driving along finished at a gate. She skidded to a halt and slammed her palms against the steering wheel in frustration. A cow watched her from the field beyond the gate. Its lower jaw moved rhythmically as it ground up a mouthful of grass. "I hope you choke," Tegan said, reaching yet again for the map. She peered at it in the fading light and wondered how many single-track lanes there were left in the area that she had not yet tried. The Egyptian was about 5 feet tall, aged perhaps in his late 40s, dirty, unshaven, and introduced himself as Kamoze. "I'm on my way to Cairo," he told the doctor and Atkins. "I often shelter in here during the heat of the day if I am passing. My feet are not as young as they once were, and it is good to rest in the cool shade, especially in a place that nobody else knows about." He glared suspiciously at the doctor and Atkins. "Or so I thought." Well, I'm sorry about that," the doctor said. "We were on an archaeological expedition here some time ago. That's how we came to know about it. I'd be interested to hear your story." "You want to know about the excavations?" It was not a question. "You were not on the expedition. I would remember you. Englishman, I would remember." "Ah," Atkins said. "So were there other English people involved?" Kamoze shook his head. "You are too eager for information. You should wait. Draw out of me what I do not know you think is important." He wagged a finger. "How do you propose to pay for my information?" The doctor stuck his hands in his trouser pockets and leaned down towards the short Egyptian. "How about the offer of transport to Cairo?" he asked. "Spare those old feet of yours." Kamoze's eyes sparkled in the torchlight. "You have a camel?" The doctor laughed. "Now who's betraying his eagerness? I can get you to Cairo far quicker than a camel." Kamoze narrowed his eyes. "A car could not get here. There are no roads. Not even a Land Rover crosses the desert in these parts." "Well, of course, if you're happy walking." The doctor gestured to Atkins, and they headed towards the main door out of the chamber. Kamoze caught up with them before they reached the corridor. "I have decided to offer you my help," he said. James Norris had converted the second bedroom of his small cottage into a study. It had not taken much work, mainly a case of putting up shelves and ensuring there were enough electrical sockets and a phone line. He was working on a set of plans for a barn conversion when there was a knock at the door. Norris lifted his head from the drawing board and stared out of the pool of angle-poised light which was the sole illumination. He frowned, checked his watch, and went to the window. The outside light was on, and in its glow he could see a figure standing outside the front door. He could not see her face, but he could see it was a young woman. The stairs creaked as he hurried down them. The staircase emerged into the corner of the main downstairs room. He crossed to the front door, drew back the bolt, and opened it. He started as the woman turned towards him. "Vanessa?" She pushed past him into the room, barely acknowledging his presence. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, head moving to and fro as if she were searching for something. "What the hell's happened to you?" Norris asked. Vanessa Pryor was in her nightgown. The hem was grubby and torn, and her feet were bare and muddy. Her toes curled on the carpet as she looked around. Norris stepped towards her, reached out intending to embrace her. But before he got close enough, she stepped away, her arm flying out. He ducked, but the gesture was not a blow. She was pointing to the mantelshelf above the fireplace, and as she walked slowly, stiffly, like a sleepwalker towards it, Norris stared at the blue ring on her wedding finger and the thick gold scarab bracelet hanging heavy on her wrist. She stopped in front of the fireplace, silent and still for a moment. Norris crossed towards her, hesitant, worried. "Look, if something's happened, can I help?" Another thought occurred to him. "Is anyone with you?" he asked. "How did you get here? I mean—" He pointed to her nightgown. But she ignored him, her eyes focused on the cobra poised to strike at the end of the shelf. She reached out for it. And he caught her hand. "Look, tell me what's wrong." Her hand inched forwards closer to the statue. "Vanessa!" And she turned and glared at him. Just for a second. Then she lashed out with her other arm, caught him across the cheek, sent him reeling across the room in surprise. Norris lay on the floor, rubbing his jaw in painful disbelief. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted. Vanessa picked up the heavy statue, winding her hand inside the snake's coils to get a better grip. She turned from the mantelpiece and advanced on Norris. He watched her incredulously as she lifted the cobra above her head, poised to crush it down on his skull. He could feel a pulse ticking in the corner of his eye, flinched as the arm started to descend, tried to push himself back and out of the way, shook his head and tried to speak. The snake slashed down at him, gathering speed. Between its coils, Norris could see Vanessa's eyes gleaming bright and wide like a cat launching finely at an injured mouse. He squeezed his eyes shut, knowing he could not avoid the blow. He heard the statue connect, the wrenching, tearing, smashing sound of it crashing into something solid, and he opened his eyes again. The statue had smashed into a small coffee table. Norris recognised it, and vaguely wondered what had happened to the half-empty coffee mug that had been resting on it a few moments earlier. He did not recognise the young woman who held the table, who was now struggling to prevent Vanessa from shoving her aside. Norris hauled himself to his feet and went to help the stranger. Together they managed to push Vanessa back towards the fireplace. Norris grabbed Vanessa by the shoulders, unsure whether to keep her at arm's length or hug her to him. "What is it? What's wrong?" he asked, as he struggled to hold her still. The young woman who had saved his life was still trying to pull the cobra statue from Vanessa's grasp, but without success. She did seem to be managing to stop her from using it as a weapon, though. "It's no good," the woman said. "She's not listening, or she can't hear you." Norris ignored her. "Vanessa, look, it's me, James." The fire in Vanessa's eyes did not diminish. She still struggled to escape, to smash the snake across his face. "Vanessa!" He was close to tears, holding her still by the shoulders, shaking her with no effect. "I love you!" He let go of her, and she fell towards him. Norris clasped Vanessa to him and pressed his mouth to hers. For a moment she was unresponsive, like a statue. Then she twisted, pulled away, her face suddenly creasing in bewilderment, tears welling in her eyes. "James?" Her voice was scarcely a murmur. She looked round as if surprised, as if waking up, disoriented. Then her eyelids fluttered, and she crumpled to the floor. Norris and the woman stood over her, breathing deeply and watching to see what would happen. But Vanessa seemed to be unconscious. The woman bent down and tried to prise the cobra from Vanessa's grip. After a while, pulling at the long, slender fingers, she gave up. "It's no good. She won't let it go." "We should lie her down," Norris said quietly. "The sofa?" Norris nodded. As they lifted Vanessa's limp body onto the couch, he asked, "Do you come from New Zealand?" Australia! The woman straightened Vanessa's legs, then stepped back and dusted her hands against each other. But not today. She turned to Norris. She was quite small, with straight, dark hair cut short. I'm Tegan. Then he knelt down beside his fiancée and took her hand. The large ring made it awkward to hold, but did not move when he gave a gentle tug to try to remove it. Will she be all right? Yes, Tegan said after the briefest pause. Yes, of course she will. Rasool's eyes snapped open. Something has happened, he muttered. The link is broken. He stared across the moonlit moors in the direction of Norris's cottage. A faint mist was rising from the area of swamp. He had driven as close as the van would get to the back of the house. A frontal approach was too risky. He could not afford to be seen, did not want to reveal his hand too early. And using Vanessa had seemed a simple and efficient solution. But now something had gone wrong, so he must play another card. Rasool turned to the huge bandaged figures beside him and gave a curt nod. The nearest mummy lurched forward and started its laborious progress towards the house. The full moon glinted off the murky surface of the swampy water. The mummy started to wade through, leaning forward as it pushed its way forward. The surface scum receded in large ripples as the enormous figure broke the surface tension and pressed its way through the swamp. Camoes took in the TARDIS without comment. If he was impressed, he did not show it. He grunted in a non-committal way and sat down cross-legged on the floor of the console room. Atkins stood beside Camoes as the Doctor set about adjusting controls on the console. "How do you know about the excavations at the tomb?" he asked. "You say the work was done 23 years ago." Camoes nodded. "I was there," he said simply. "They were looking for workers, and I had a mother and a family to feed. Then..." He rearranged the rags he was wearing and patted his canvas bag to check it was still there. "You were a part of the expedition?" Atkins asked. Camoes nodded. "It was well-paid work. 3 weeks we spent working in shifts all day and night. Each piece of stone was numbered and coded before we could remove it. Then it was packed away and labelled again." "Why?" Camoes looked up. "So that they could reconstruct the tomb exactly." The Doctor had joined them, the central column of the console rising and falling slowly behind him. "So that who could reconstruct it?" he asked. Camoes looked from the Doctor to Atkins, as if unable to believe they did not know. "You are from England, no?" Atkins nodded. "And have you not seen the tomb, the reconstruction?" "Seen it?" the Doctor asked. "Seen it where?" "They told us it was to be rebuilt, in the British Museum." Norris and Tegan sat on the floor beside the couch sipping brandy. Vanessa was still unconscious, the snake statue gripped firmly in her hand. Tegan was unusually quiet, while Norris was uncharacteristically garrulous. He was keen to talk about Vanessa, about how they met at Pryor's, about the party the previous night. Tegan told him a little about the Doctor, but Norris took this as an opening to talk about the party again. Yes, he had met the Doctor and Atkins, but he did not remember Tegan. Tegan was doing her best to draw the conversation back to the subject of Vanessa and what might be wrong with her. "I saw her last night," she said, "outside the kitchen. She seemed a bit distant, like a sleepwalker." "We had an argument," Norris said. He leaned over and stroked Vanessa's hair. "Nothing important. It never is." He half smiled sadly. "My fault, of course. I forget how young she is, how sensitive." Tegan opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, they both heard the sound of heavy footsteps dragging on the gravel outside. "Are you expecting anyone else?" Norris climbed to his feet. "I wasn't expecting anyone at all." He walked quickly to the front door and slid home the bolt. Then he went over to a tall wooden cabinet beside the door to the kitchen, scrabbled around on the top, and pulled down a key. "You never know," he said quietly as he unlocked the cabinet. Inside was a bag of golf clubs, a fishing rod, and a double-barreled shotgun. He pulled out the shotgun and hunted through a pile of junk at the bottom of the cabinet for a box of cartridges. The footsteps were louder now, shuffling towards the front door. Tegan stood against the far wall, listening for a knock, hoping that it was as simple as someone lost on the moors. Beside her, Norris broke open the shotgun, pushed in 2 cartridges, and snapped it shut again. The silence seemed to last forever as they stood together, facing the front door of the cottage. Then the handle moved, turned, and they could hear the rattle as the door was pushed against the bolt. The rattling stopped, and Tegan crossed her fingers behind her back, hoping whoever was at the door would give up and move on. The sound was amplified in the confines of the cottage, echoing off the stone walls. With a wrenching noise like a scream of tortured agony, the door hinges were ripped from the frame. The door splintered, exploding inwards. Pieces of wood flew across the room, scattering over the carpet. The screws holding the bolt tore from their sockets, and the shattered remains of the heavy door crashed to the floor. The figure in the doorway was thrown into silhouette by the bright moonlight outside. It paused for a moment on the threshold, then stepped inside, bandaged feet smashing through the panels of the door lying in front of it. Tegan screamed. She recognised the mummy as identical to the creatures that had attacked the camp in Egypt. The lower half of its body was soaking wet, discoloured with grime and mud. Norris gaped at the mummy in amazement. Then he raised the shotgun to his shoulder and fired. One of the barrels spat flame, and the mummy lurched back under the impact. The bandages on the upper body tore and smoked as the lead shot ripped through. The creature steadied itself and started across the room towards them. "Run!" Tegan shouted, pulling at Norris's sleeve. "You can't stop that thing!" But Norris stood his ground as the mummy lurched towards them. Then it halted, and Tegan realised with horror what it had actually come for. It had stopped in front of the sofa, and as they watched, it bent slowly forwards, reaching out for the unconscious body of Vanessa. "No!" shouted Norris, dropping the gun and hurling himself across the room at the mummy. He dived over the back of the couch and collided with the creature's chest, sending it reeling backwards. He landed in a winded heap on the carpet. The mummy recovered immediately and started back towards Vanessa. Norris grabbed at its foot, hugged it to him in a tight embrace, and grunted in pain as the mummy wrenched it free from his grasp. Tegan grabbed the gun from the floor and leaped between the mummy and Vanessa. "I don't know if you understand this," she said, "but stop right there, Boris." The mummy took no notice, reaching out to brush aside the weapon just as Tegan closed her eyes and fired. The shot ripped up the mummy's outstretched arm and tore into its shoulder. It staggered back, cloth smouldering and torn across its chest. Then it smashed Tegan aside and continued inexorably across the room. It bent down in front of the couch, reaching out for Vanessa. Then, surprisingly gently, it scooped her limp body into its arms and lifted her up. Tegan and Norris lay together in a crumpled heap on the floor. They watched helplessly as the mummy carried Vanessa through the broken remains of the door and out into the night. Tegan struggled to her feet and ran to see where it was going. Norris was close behind her, choking back a sob. The mummy was almost out of sight, round the corner of the house. They ran to catch up, and watched in silence as it strode through the back garden and started across the swamp. It was dusk, and the last tourists had left. There was nobody to hear the echoing grind and wheeze of the TARDIS as it faded into existence in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. The door swung open, and the Doctor stepped out. He stopped dead, frowned, and then stepped aside to let Atkins and Camoes join him. "Not quite as planned, I'm afraid," the Doctor said, "but fairly close." "The Great Pyramid," Atkins breathed. "Yes, The doctor swung round, hands in pockets. The lights were still lit for the day's visitors, throwing their shadows distorted and lengthened onto the walls. Pyramid power. I should have realised. "What's that, Doctor?" "What? Oh, yes, of course." The doctor set off across the chamber. "Let's get Commose pointing towards Cairo. We can talk on the way." He noticed Atkins's worried glance at the TARDIS. "Don't worry. Like the sarcophagus there." He gestured to the huge open coffin hewn from a single block of stone. "The TARDIS is too big to fit through the door." Atkins nodded. "We know that the pyramid was built around the casket, Doctor." "Was it?" The doctor grinned. "And will the same archaeologists who are so sure of that maintain that it was also built around the TARDIS?" Commose and Atkins stared at the doctor. Commose was the first to speak. "Are you saying—" he started, but the doctor waved him to silence. "They're probably right. Though, of course, it isn't a sarcophagus. No body was ever found buried inside a pyramid. You will recall that this chamber was empty, save for the casket when it was found." "Is that to do with pyramid power?" Atkins asked as they left the chamber and started down the corridor outside. "In a way. The shape of the pyramid is perfect. It's designed to focus power beamed from Osiris and from a relay station on Mars. It's that focusing ability which drew the TARDIS here when I tried to land nearby. She operates on a similar sort of energy." They reached a junction in the corridor, and the doctor waved a finger tentatively at one of the passages. "This way, I think," he said, setting off down the other one. "The power to operate the services, the mummies, the time-travel sarcophagus at the museum, all the Osiran technology, in fact, goes through this relay chain." "Chain?" "Yes. The pyramids, which are built in the shape of the constellation of Orion." The doctor stopped and turned to Atkins, whom almost cannoned into him. "Where did you think the power came from?" he asked abruptly. Atkins shook his head. "Can't we shut it off somehow?" he asked. "Would that help?" "I don't know what it would do," the doctor admitted as he set off again. "But, since that would involve destroying Osiris, which Sutekh has already done, the entire constellation of Orion, which nobody would thank us for, Mars, which would throw the solar system off balance in a rather big way, or most of Egypt, I don't think we're about to find out. Do you?" The full moon shone across the dark, rippling water of the swamp. Trees overhung the edges in the distance, framing the scene. Rasool watched the mummy wading through the water towards him, its bandages tattered, muddied, and riddled with pellet holes. It was carrying the woman across its outstretched arms. The water was up above the mummy's knees, but it continued walking towards Rasool, seemingly unworried how deep the swamp might be. The woman flopped like a doll, her long, straight, dark hair cascading down from her lolling head and dripping into the water. Her features were classical, slightly aquiline. She was slumped as if unconscious, although her eyes were open. Cat's eyes with large pupils. She was wearing a white nightgown, legs dangling from its white hem. In one hand she held a carved statuette of a cobra, gripping it tight. On her wedding finger was a ring inset with a blue stone shaped into a scarab beetle. Round her wrist an ornate Egyptian bracelet of gold. Rasool waited as the mummy slowly approached. His attention was focused on the woman. He did not see Vanessa, but another woman, a figure from across the millennia. "But why Mars, Doctor?" They were in a walkway close to the outer edge of the pyramid. As Atkins spoke, they reached a low window looking out over the desert. It was little more than a small square hole in the side of the structure, allowing the dying sunlight to creep in and wash across the stone floor. "It's the one planet in the solar system without a magnetic pole. No disruption. So they could gather the energy from a fairly diffuse beam over such a distance. Osiran technology depends on magnetic monopoles, which only work outside the influence of a bipolar magnetic field. Some power keeps the Martian end of things running, like the Eye of Horus and the force field generators. The rest they refocus and relay to Earth, which does have magnetic poles. The Doctor nodded. He stopped and looked out of the window. The pyramids collect the energy beam, then pass the power on to the dispersal point. That gathers it all up again, boosts it like a transformer, and sends it out to power the mummies, the sarcophagus, and whatever else there is that the Osirians want to keep running. Commose seemed to be following even less of the conversation than Atkins. "What is this dispersal point?" he asked. "Another pyramid?" Atkins hazarded. The Doctor shook his head and nodded at the window. Atkins and Commose both crowded closer to see out. The sun was setting slowly, its flames licking round the head of the Sphinx as it fell. They both turned and looked back at the Doctor. He nodded. The line the sun takes as it sinks traces perfectly round the head of the Sphinx when viewed from here. What perfect geometry! He shook his head in admiration and set off down the corridor once more. "The Sphinx!" Atkins hastened to catch up. "It's older than most people think. When it was carved out of the living rock, and I mean living, between 8 and 10,000 years ago, the sun would have risen exactly between the Sphinx's feet. But that's older than the pyramids." "Of course. The dispersal unit was built and charged up by the Osirians. Then, when they departed, they left strict instructions on how to build the pyramids to supply a constant stream of power. On Mars, they either did the building themselves or found another religiously fanatical people to do it for them. I can think of a couple of candidates." "I have heard it said," Commose spoke quietly, and they slowed to let him catch up so they could hear, "that there is a Sphinx on Mars." Atkins guffawed loudly, then stopped suddenly. "Is that true?" "Oh yes," Commose said seriously. "But it was an American from Oregon. I do not know if they can be trusted any more or less than other Americans." Atkins frowned. "I meant, is it true that there is a Sphinx on Mars?" "Of course," the Doctor was off again, lengthening his stride. "That's how the refocused power gets beamed onto Earth. And both Sphinxes have their heads reshaped, as it were, to resemble a great local ruler. The original face of the Sphinx was the face of Horus." He paused at a junction, then continued along the passage they were in. "There's an identical set of pyramids too, though they look like a range of mountains from space." "Great undertaking," Commose offered. "Yes, ingenious, but not without its problems." "Such as?" asked Atkins. "Well, as the angle of the Earth slowly alters, the alignment moves off, so the power is dissipated over time. Constellations shift, alignments change, sunrise is in a slightly different position. The sunset is a less perfect match to the Sphinx's shape as the Earth moves and the Sphinx erodes. Also, the Sphinx periodically gets buried. That fogs the focus, so to speak." "So, it's best to keep it clear of sand?" Atkins asked. "I see it has been dug out since I last saw it." Commose looked sideways at Atkins but said nothing. The Doctor nodded. "There's something of a fail-safe for that, though, I fancy. Remember the story that Thutmose was told by the Sphinx in a dream to dig it out? More than likely, that was a pulse of Osirian mental energy focused on someone with the power to make it happen, while he was in a particularly receptive position relative to the pyramids and the Sphinx." Atkins recalled the legend. He was sleeping by the head of the Sphinx, which was buried up to its neck. He rested in its shadow during the heat of the day. The Doctor stopped again, and this time Atkins did walk into him. The Doctor spun round, but seemed not to have noticed the collision. "Of course," he said. "I should have realised." "What?" "Napoleon had the Sphinx dug out as well, and just before he gave the orders, he visited this pyramid. According to contemporary reports, he insisted on taking just one trusted captain inside as a guide. and he left him outside the great chamber when he went in. When he came out of the pyramid, he was white and shaking with fear. Atkins struggled to fit this into the facts they already had. You think he saw some manifestation of the Sphinx's power? The doctor bit at his lower lip. It would be an enormous coincidence if he didn't. They had reached a corner in the corridor. The doctor rounded it first. Ah, he said loudly, and they hurried to catch up. The corridor opened out slightly ahead of them, and in the distance they could see the opening. An iron gate barred the end of the passage, the darkening desert visible beyond. Now then, said the doctor as they reached the gate, we'll just let our good friend here through, then we'll see if we can't find some record of who was behind the expedition. He pulled a piece of wire from his top pocket and set to work on the lock. After a few moments it clicked free, and the gate swung open. The doctor gestured for Commose to go first. Thank you for all your help, he said. If anything else happens to occur to you, perhaps you could leave a message with whoever mans this gate tomorrow. Commose stood for a moment in the gateway, looking out across the desert as the sun set behind the Sphinx. Is the shape of the Sphinx significant in itself, Doctor? He asked. The doctor and Atkins followed his gaze. The Sphinx was backlit by a glorious crimson glow. I don't know, the doctor admitted. Probably it's geometrically primed to accept and hold the energy, but it's more complex than the pyramid designs. I remember little of detail about the excavations, Commose said quietly, except what I have already told you. There was great care taken in the cataloguing and packing, but an unhealthy speed to the excavation work itself. There were accidents, of course. One in particular I remember. He turned towards the doctor and Atkins. They were listening carefully, and Commose went on. The man in charge, the man I think you seek, got careless. He climbed a pile of stones that had been cut from the tomb, I think to see how the work was progressing beyond them. The stone shifted, moved, and he fell. Was he killed? Asked Atkins. Oh no, but his leg was trapped and broken in the fall. He refused to take time to have it set, insisted on remaining at the site and continuing to oversee the work. The physician did his best, but he said the Englishman would never fully recover. Englishman? Oh yes, he was English, I told you. The excavations were for the British Museum. And did he recover? Commose shook his head. I was reminded of the incident just now. The Englishman bought himself a walking stick from one of the expedition who had worked on it in the evenings, between the shifts. The handle was carved into the shape of the Sphinx. London, 1991. The smell of petrol was everywhere. He had to hold the handkerchief tight to his face to keep the fumes out, and still he was coughing. He held the can away from his body, careful not to get the clear viscous liquid on his clothes. He was backing down the stairs, shaking the can as he went, spilling an intermittent stream of fluid over the carpet. When he reached the bottom, he continued to back round the staircase. He came level with the door and set down the jerry can. He had checked the floor twice already, but he ducked through the door into the area under the stairs once more. The cupboard was dark, but the light from the hallway illuminated the floor, and the fresh cement which concealed and protected the trapdoor beneath. Satisfied, Aubrey Pryor closed the door behind him. They could chip out the cement afterwards, could dig their way back into the cellar, to the mummy. He paused in the doorway, looked round the hall for the last time. Then he struck a match, heard the zip of the match head along the strip of sandpaper, watched the flare of ignition, and tossed the tiny flame into the house. He jumped back, slamming the door before the hall erupted into a mass of flames. From his car across the road, Sadan Rasool watched as Pryor ran from the house. Then he lifted the hourglass from the dashboard and held it up to the light of the fire as it took hold in the main hallway of Kenilworth House. The sand trickled almost imperceptibly from the upper bowl of glass. But Rasool smiled and nodded. So soon now, and it would be finished. So soon. The flames licked up the staircase and swirled along the hall, driven by the draught from the open windows. In the cellar, the mummy lay calm and still, oblivious to the inferno raging above her.